The ridge lay quiet under a sky hard as iron, the snow glittering with a beauty that cut as deep as it dazzled. Pines leaned heavy with ice, their branches whispering in the wind. Elias McKenna moved through the drifts like part of the mountain itself, broad-shouldered, silent, a man whose beard carried frost as easily as breath. It was the winter of 1885, high above the town of Elk Fork in the Wyoming Territory. For 6 years he had walked this ridge alone, his silence guarded as fiercely as his rifle. By the frozen creek he found them, a woman half buried in alder, her sleeve dark with blood, and a child tugging hard at her coat, mittens stiff with ice, her small body straining against the weight she could not move. Elias stepped down the bank. Snow groaned under his boots. The girl froze, chin lifted like a colt ready to bolt. He opened his hands, palms bare. Her voice cracked, thin and desperate. "Please, save my mama." The words cut sharper than the cold. The woman stirred, lashes crusted with frost. Her lips cracked around the words. "Posse, 3, maybe 4. They won't quit. Not after what I did." Her gaze flicked to the trees, as if the branches still held her pursuers. The girl pressed closer to her mother, eyes locked on Elias as though daring him to refuse. Elias bent low, eyes sharp on the wound. A bullet through the upper arm. Bad, but not hopeless. He scooped the girl beneath one arm, slung the woman across his shoulder with the other. The child clung to his coat, mittens clutching furiously. "What's your name?" Elias asked, already turning uphill. "Maggie," the girl said, her breath fogging the air. "Mama is Rebecca." The climb was steep, the wind sharper, each gust cutting through his coat. Snow burned his beard white, but Elias kept steady, boots finding their mark without hesitation. The cabin came into view at last, squatting dark against the pines. His dog stood rigid on the porch, hackles high, rumble deep in his chest. "Easy," Elias said. The dog's eyes never left the stranger's, but he stepped aside. Inside, heat came fast as Elias stoked the stove until the iron rang. He laid Rebecca on his bed, peeled back her sleeve, and set to work with moss, whiskey, and a needle threaded with catgut. His hands were rough, but steady as stone. Maggie dragged a stool to fetch water, spilling some in her hurry. She frowned, cheeks hot with frustration. Elias only set the tin cup by the bed. "Sip slow," he told Rebecca. Her eyes opened, glassy but grateful. "Why? Why help us?" He didn't look up from the stitches. Winter's long. Stranger thing than company is silence. Maggie edged closer to the dog, crumbs hidden in her pocket. She held one out with mittened fingers. The animal sniffed, then licked her hand, tail thumping once against the floorboards. "See?" Maggie whispered, proud. "He likes me." Rebecca's gaze softened, the shadow of a smile tugging against her pain. Elias tied off the stitch and cut it short. The cabin held steady in the storm, its silence altered. The mountain, once only his, had delivered him strangers, and with them a verdict yet to come. Night closed over the ridge like a lid on a chest. Wind rattled the shutters, slipping through cracks in the logs, testing every seam. Inside, the fire glowed hard against the cold, its light carving deep shadows across the cabin walls. Elias sat at the table, rifle laid across his knees, a rag working in slow, measured circles along the barrel. Each stroke was as steady as a man keeping count of time he refused to name. Rebecca lay against the headboard, her arm bound tight, sleep dragging her under in fits. Each time her breath hitched, Maggie inched closer until she was curled against her mother like a small shadow. The dog stretched before the door, ears flicking at sounds only he could hear. The cabin no longer felt empty. The air was weighted with their presence, a hush not of solitude but of waiting. Elias tried to keep his eyes on the rifle, but the girl drew his attention like a candle draws a moth. She slid from the bed, bare feet whispering over the boards, and crouched beside the dog. Small fingers scratched his ears. For the first time in years, the animal gave a low whine, leaning into her touch. Elias's hand stilled on the cloth. A stone shifted in his chest. He set the rifle aside, slower than before. From the bed, Rebecca stirred, her eyes catching the firelight. Her voice was quiet, steady despite the fever's pull. "And what debt keeps you here, Elias McKenna? A man doesn't bury himself alive for nothing." For a long moment the fire cracked and filled the silence between them. Elias's jaw tightened. Some debts don't take payment. Rebecca did not press further. She lowered her gaze, brushing Maggie's hair with her hand. The girl lifted her face, her voice a whisper carried through the dim. "You'll save her, won't you? Please, save my mama." The word struck harder than the storm outside. Elias looked away, resuming his slow work on the rifle. But the rhythm of his hand had changed. The silence in the cabin no longer felt like armor. It felt like a verdict waiting to be spoken. Morning came brittle and gray. The storm had swept clean, leaving the world bright and sharp as cut glass. Elias stepped outside, boots grinding against the crust. His breath rose in coils against the pale sky. The ridge opened wide before him, snowfields glittering, peaks lit with a fire the sun had struck from stone. Beauty pressed close here, but so did the danger. Two sets of tracks wound below, one dragged by blood, each mark carrying like ink on white paper. He stood long, watching the tree line. No riders yet, but he knew they would come. A man could run from his conscience, but not from prints in snow. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and beans. Rebecca sat upright now, her back braced against the wall. Her gaze followed him through the window. When he came back in, she asked, steady but quiet, "Will they follow us?" "They will." He hung his coat by the stove, slung the kettle over the fire. "When they do, you listen close. No questions. No heroics. You do what I say. Clear?" Rebecca held his eyes, her lips pale against her skin. "Why help us at all?" His mouth opened, but instead of words, memory came. The jailhouse fire from years ago roared back, smoke curling thick, timbers collapsing in sparks, a boy coughing behind iron bars he could not break. He had clawed at the red-hot metal until it branded his hands, the flames searing while the lock held fast. The boy's cries faded into fire, and Elias sat in silence, fists tightening as if the bars were still in his grip. Rebecca's voice cut through the silence. "You were calling a name," she said. Elias stared at the floorboards. "Someone I failed." Her voice softened, though it held no pity. "Or someone you loved." The fire cracked. He said nothing, only shifted the kettle until steam curled from the lid. Maggie stirred from her blanket in the corner, hair tousled, eyes half shut. She stumbled across the floor and pressed herself against her mother's side. Rebecca wrapped her good arm around the child, kissed the top of her head, then looked again at Elias. "You can't keep ghosts forever," she said. Elias gave no reply. But when he sat back at the table, rifle across his knees, his eyes lingered on the small shape curled against Rebecca. And the silence in the cabin felt less like a wall, more like a question waiting for its answer. Snow climbed waist-high against the cabin walls. Days shrank to embers of light, swallowed quick by the mountain. Elias split kindling near the door, then set the hatchet in Maggie's small hands. Her grip was awkward, her tongue caught between her teeth as she swung. The blade clattered against the wood, leaving no mark. She stamped her foot, cheeks red with cold. "It's cheating," she told the log. "If it won't break, I'll tell Papa when I see him in heaven." Elias paused, something tightening behind his ribs. He crouched, shifting her grip lower. "Try again." The next swing split the piece clean. Maggie's eyes shone with victory. Elias ruffled her hair, rough but careful. Later, inside, Rebecca worked at mending one of his shirts, her needle moving neat despite the bandaged arm. She hummed a tune, soft as a thread, carrying the lilt of a place south of the territory. Elias tried not to listen, but the sound snagged in him. Maggie drew in the frost on the window, etching 4 stick legs, a crooked neck, and a wide, clumsy smile. "That your mama's?" Elias asked. She shook her head. "Papa's. He got shot." Elias's throat tightened. He hesitated, then let the word slip. "Mine too." Rebecca looked up from her sewing, the firelight catching her face. Her eyes softened. "I wondered," she said. Elias busied himself with the kettle, though the moment pressed hard between them. That evening, Maggie sang scraps of her mother's lullaby to the dog, off-key but certain. The animal rested his head in her lap, tail thumping against the floor. Elias sharpened his knife at the table, the tune tugging until he found himself humming under his breath. Rebecca caught it, a faint smile warming her tired face. "Didn't take you for a singer." Elias's eyes stayed on the blade. "Didn't take you for a gunslinger." Silence followed, changed, not empty. For the first time in years, it felt less like armor and more like company. The sky burned white with winter sun, snow dazzling like hammered tin. Elias swung his axe, splitting a log with a crack that echoed off the slopes. The dog stiffened first, fur bristling, a growl deep in his chest. Elias turned. 3 riders crested the rise, horses blowing steam, rifles easy across their laps. The man in front wore a black duster that flared like wings as his horse shifted. His smile was thin and sharp as glass. "Afternoon," he called, tracking a woman and her girl. "Shot a man in Cheyenne Wells. You seen him?" Elias set the axe head down on the stump, hands loose but steady. "Don't get company." "That so?" The leader swung down, boots crunching. "Mind if we look around?" Behind Elias, the cabin door stood half open. Through the frost glass window, Rebecca's shadow flickered past. Elias shifted, blocking their line of sight. "Place is small," he said, "not much to see." The man's fingers brushed his holster. "Step aside, old man." Elias's mouth curved in a smile that held no warmth. "You'll find I ain't old, just particular." The moment cracked. The man reached for iron. Elias's Winchester barked twice. One rider fell hard into the snow. Another screamed, clutching his thigh. Black Duster dove behind the woodpile, rifle flashing in his hand. Elias dropped low, rolled, and fired again before backing into the cabin. He slammed the door and dropped the bar. "Back room." His voice cut like a command. "Both of you, stay put," Maggie cried out, clinging to Rebecca as she swept her into the shadows. The dog crouched low by the threshold, teeth bared. Elias cracked the shutter, rifle steady. Outside, the snow was torn with hoof prints and blood, men's curses scattering across the slope. Rebecca whispered from the dark, her voice tight with fear. "How many?" Elias didn't take his eye from the window. "Enough." The mountain loomed silent beyond the tree line, its beauty cruel, its judgment waiting. Elias chambered the next round. They had until sunset. Then the ridge itself would decide who remained. The first assault came fast. 2 riders charged the front, boots pounding, rifles raised. Elias fired buckshot through the doorframe. The blast ripped splinters into the snow. One man dropped, the other scrambled back with a cry. Gun smoke clung to the rafters. Elias reloaded, breath measured, while the dog bristled at the door. Then Rebecca appeared, an old Sharps rifle cradled in her good arm, the oiled cloth still dangling from the stock. Her jaw was set, her eyes unwavering. "I can shoot," she said. Elias studied her. Her hands were steady. He gave a single nod. She moved to the eastern window. He took the west. Between them, Maggie huddled beneath the table, whispering to the dog as if her words could hold the cabin together. "Don't be scared, Biscuit. We'll be all right." Black Duster shouted across the ridge. "Rebecca, give us the girl, and we'll let you walk." Another voice, slick with cruelty. Mountain man can't save you. He'll be the first to die. Rebecca stiffened, fingers white on the rifle. Elias leaned close, his voice a whisper. They're trying to break you. Don't let them. Her eyes flicked to him. Why do you care if they break me? He chambered around, gaze fixed on the shutter. Because silence don't keep a child warm. Hours dragged, shadows stretched across the floor. Every creak outside felt like the beginning of the end. Once, a man crept near enough to whisper through the log wall, "We'll salt your bones in the snow." Elias steadied his breath and fired through the voice. Silence answered. Then a torch slammed against the logs, pitch flaring bright. Smoke curled through the cracks, thick and black, seeping into the rafters. Sparks spat across the floorboards. Maggie whimpered, pressing her face into Rebecca's skirts. Elias's eyes cut to Rebecca. When the flames push them to circle, we go out the back. You keep the girl close, head for the ravine. I'll cover. Rebecca touched his sleeve, not by accident. Her voice was fierce, low. And you? Don't wait. She shook her head, her eyes hard in the firelight. I've waited too long already. Above them, the roof groaned. Smoke filled the cabin. The dog barked sharp, the sound ragged and urgent. Elias shoved the back door wide and fired into the dark, clearing a path. Run, he shouted. Rebecca pulled Maggie onto her back and plunged into the snow. Elias followed into the storm, fire roaring behind them, gunfire waiting ahead. Snow dragged at their legs, rising to their thighs, every step a battle. Rebecca stumbled forward with Maggie clinging to her back, the child's arms wrapped tight around her neck. Elias moved behind, rifle in one hand, the other sliding cartridges into his belt by touch. The forest roared with wind, but beneath it came the sound of men branches snapping, curses tearing through the dark as the posse split to encircle them. At the mouth of a narrow ravine, Elias stopped. The ground dropped into a chute of stone and deadfall, a passage one man could hold against three if he had the will. His breath came hard, frost white on his beard. Follow the creek, he said, voice flat but certain. It bends to the old logging trail. 2 days hard, you'll make town. Rebecca spun on him, her face pale in the moonlight. Not without you. You don't have a choice. He pressed 5 cartridges into her hand, his fingers closing hers around them. For the sharps. Keep Maggie safe. Her jaw clenched. Don't you dare make me bury another man. Elias shook his head, eyes fixed on the ravine. Better me than the girl. Maggie twisted in Rebecca's arms, reaching for him with her small bare hands. Come with us, she pleaded. Elias bent low, awkward, letting her small arms loop around his neck. She smelled of wool and wood smoke. Thank you for my horse drawing, she whispered, her voice hot against his ear. His throat closed. He stood quick, forcing his hands to push them toward the dark draw. Run. Rebecca's eyes locked on his, fierce with refusal. I won't leave you. You will, he said, steady now. That's how you keep her alive. The posse's shouts drew closer, the storm of their boots tearing at the night. Rebecca held Elias's gaze one last time, then turned, stumbling into the ravine with Maggie clinging tight. Elias stayed where he was, rifle raised, the mountain's cold silence folding around him. Elias crouched behind a fallen log, the moon silvering the snow until the world looked carved from bone. His lungs burned, each breath sharp against the bruises in his ribs. He listened. The crack of branches, boots crunching closer. Black Duster came first, cursing the drifts. His shadow stretched long across the ravine. Elias steadied his rifle and fired. The man spun, slammed into the snow, still spitting oaths as blood darkened the drift. Another outlaw circled wide, wary and deliberate. Elias pivoted too late. They collided, rolling hard in the powder, fists striking wild. A blade flashed and bit into Elias's side, heat flooding through the cold. He grunted, slammed his forehead into the man's nose, felt bone give. The knife wavered between them, each breath a battle. The outlaw pressed the blade down. Elias's arm shook. Then a rifle cracked, sharp as the splitting of stone. The man jerked, eyes wide, and fell still against the snow. Rebecca stood beyond, the Sharp's rifle smoking in her hands. Her breath fogged, her face pale but unshaken. Elias shoved the body aside and forced himself upright, gasping. "You came back," he rasped. She dropped beside him, pressing her palm hard against his wound. "I told you. We'd waited long enough." He caught her eyes, saw the fire there, the refusal to let him vanish into silence. For the first time in years, something inside him eased, not victory, but the weight of no longer standing alone. They came into Elk Fork, worn thin, their boots caked with ice, their bodies bent by hunger and pain. The town's one street lay quiet under a low sky, false front stores leaning against each other, a livery steaming with horses, and a church still draped in pine, long brown since Christmas. Elias sagged into the doctor's chair, teeth gritted while the needle pulled his side closed. Rebecca stood close, Maggie pressed against her hip, watching every stitch. The doctor clucked at the depth of the wound, muttered at Rebecca's half-healed arm, then left them to their silence. The sheriff came, hat low over his eyes, boots heavy on the porch boards. He listened as Elias told it plain. The riders, the siege, the ravine. His jaw worked, chewing the story as though it had splinters. "There's a bounty on Black Duster's men," he said at last. "Enough to keep you in flour and firewood for a year. But don't think that buys you trust. Folks remember the jailhouse fire, McKenna. Some say a man who let iron bars burn has no right wearing a star again." The words cut sharp, but Elias gave no reply. His gaze wandered past the sheriff, back to the ridge rising white in the distance. Later, on the hotel porch, he sat hunched, coat pulled close, watching the mountains he had once called his prison. From this distance, they looked softer, the peaks brushed with light like smoke. Rebecca stepped out and joined him, Maggie asleep against her shoulder. She followed his gaze. "The town's looking for a deputy," she said. "Someone who knows the high country. Someone steady." Elias's eyes stayed on the mountains. "I ain't steady." Rebecca shifted Maggie in her arms, then looked straight at him. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You're steadier than most, and steadier than you think." The porch boards creaked beneath their weight, and for a moment neither spoke. Down the street, a blacksmith's hammer rang out, iron against iron, the sound carrying steady into the dusk. Elias listened, and the heaviness in his chest rolled a little more, not gone, but lighter. Spring crept slow to the high ridge, but when it came, it softened everything the winter had carved sharp. Snow pulled back into clear water, rushing the creek until it sang through the trees. Wildflowers pricked the thawed earth, yellow, violet, and white, scattered like sparks against the dark soil. The mountains still towered, solemn and vast, yet in the warmer light they looked less like prison walls and more like guardians standing watch. Elias built again where fire had ruined, hammering new walls into place, this time raising 2 rooms and cutting windows that opened wide to the south. Rebecca planted beans along the creek's edge, her hands dark with soil, her face lifted to the sun. Maggie chased butterflies through the clearing, the dog bounding at her side, renamed Biscuit for the color of his fur. Her laughter carried clear, brightening the silence that once had pressed so heavy. One evening they sat on the porch, the ridge washed in rose and gold. Elias rocked in his chair, his frame heavy with wear but steadier than it had been in years. Rebecca handed him a tin cup of coffee before settling close beside him. "Remember when you said you weren't steady?" she asked. "Yep." His voice was quiet, nearly lost to the breeze in the pines. "Changed your mind?" Elias looked at her then, his eyes catching the last of the light. Her gaze held his without fear, steady as the ground underfoot. "Reckon I'm home," he said. For a long moment, The mountains held their silence. Then Rebecca leaned in, her lips brushing his. Gentle, unhurried, not born of desperation but of trust. Elias breathed her in, the weight he had carried for years loosening. When she pulled back, her hand lingered at his jaw, and this time he did not flinch from the touch. The ridge lay hushed, but it was no longer the silence of grief. It carried the promise of something new, 2 lives bound not in loss, but in belonging. The meadow lay green now, the creek running clear where winter once froze it, silent. Wildflowers bent in the wind, their colors bright against the slope. Elias stood beside Rebecca in the clearing he had cut, Maggie holding both their hands. The sheriff had ridden up from town, hat in hand, to stand as justice of the peace. His voice was plain, without flourish, fitting for a place where pine and stone bore witness. Marriage, he said, ain't just a promise before men. It's a vow before whatever higher judge watches over these ridges. Do you, Elias McKenna, vow to guard this woman and her child, not just with your rifle, but with your life? Elias's voice was quiet but sure. I do. The sheriff turned to Rebecca. And do you, Rebecca, vow to walk with this man, through storm and silence, making his home your own, and giving him yours? Rebecca's eyes did not waver. I do. Maggie squeezed their hands, her voice carrying small but clear. And I do too. The sheriff smiled, resting his hand on his Bible. Then, by law of the territory and witness of these mountains, I declare you husband and wife. Elias bent, brushed his lips against Rebecca's, gentle but certain, sealing the vow. Maggie clapped. The dog barked once, and the wind moved through the pines like a hymn. The mountains stood vast and unchanging, but in that silence, a new sound lived. Family, bound not in stone or fire, but in promise kept.